Call Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on the International Finance Agreement Amendments Bill on behalf of the Green Party. This bill essentially does a couple of things. Firstly, it implements some changes to the articles of the IMF, which are some voting changes, very minor changes in voting proportions in the International Monetary Fund. But much more importantly, it changes the way that future changes in the articles of the IMF are approved or not by the New Zealand government. Previously, any changes in the articles of the IMF had to be agreed by the legislature, by this House, before they could be fully implemented by the New Zealand government. Even though the New Zealand government might agree to them at the IMF, they actually had to pass through and be legislated before they took full effect. What this bill does is it gives the executive, the cabinet, effectively, the power to implement changes to changes to the IMF articles, or rather to agree to changes to IMF articles without consulting the Parliament and without getting the approval of the Parliament. That's quite a significant change, and that is the fundamental reason why we're not going to be supporting this bill. We think it's important that if the New Zealand government is to agree to changes in voting rights at the IMF, that should come back to the New Zealand Parliament. Now, this isn't a particularly onerous job. From what we could tell, there's been half a dozen changes to the IMF articles that have needed approval from the New Zealand Parliament in the space of 40 or 50 years. So it's not like the government of the day would have to be coming back to the Parliament every year even, or every week, but very infrequently, in order to get changes approved that the New Zealand government could agree to changes in the articles to the IMF. So we think it's important that the Parliament retains that right. This is part of a general trend in legislation which has been going on for some years now, whereby delegated decision-making or secondary legislation or regulations basically there's a lot of movement of rule-making or law-making into regulations and away from primary legislation. And what we're seeing here with this bill is another part of that broader pattern of taking away the right of Parliament to make the rules or the law, and Parliament, through the government's majority, delegating that to the government of the day in the form of regulations, and that's what's happening here. Now, it's quite important because the IMF is pretty critical. In the post-war period, there were three great institutions that were established or not established. The first, of course, was the International Monetary Fund. The second was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank. And the third was what was called then the International Trade Organisation. The third institution, of course, was never established because the US Congress refused to support the establishment of an international trade organisation, and it was only much later in 1995 with the establishment of the World Trade Organisation that the third global institution came into being. Now, the IMF has played a constructive role over many years. However, in the 80s and 90s, it got taken over, as did many of the English-speaking Western world, by the new right crazies. And so the IMF started to introduce a series of ridiculous proposals which have been enormously destructive. And so they adopted the Washington Consensus around deregulation, privatisation, monetarism, and all the rest, the full catastrophe. And that's been enormously destructive. And so the IMF became enormously unpopular internationally during that period. The former chief economist, of course, at the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, who was the vice president of the World Bank, was highly critical of the IMF and the role of the IMF, particularly during the Asian financial crisis in 1997, when the IMF played a particularly destructive role in making the Asian financial crisis much, much worse. And not only Stiglitz, but a series of very mainstream and important economists have been highly critical of the role of the IMF through the 80s and 90s. Neo-colonialism was a term that was used quite a lot about the role of the IMF. Now, for those reasons, democratic reform of the IMF has been high on the agenda of progressives internationally. And the Greens have been advocates for democratic reform of the voting rights in the IMF. As has been stated earlier, the basic situation at the moment is the United States retains a veto over decision-making at the IMF because it holds 16% of the voting rights, and essentially you need more than 85% to get a decision through. So the IMF has retained the United States has retained its veto rights. Now, in the voting reforms that are being proposed, which date back to 2008, this isn't a recent event. This Parliament has taken a long time to get around to approving this, but they date back to 2008. There's very minor changes in the voting rights. About 6% of the voting rights are moving towards the big new developing economies. And of that, about 2.5% is actually coming from other developed countries. So it's not like it's a big reform coming from the United States, who obviously should be giving up some voting rights, but rather it's a very minor reform, some of which is actually at the expense of other developing countries. So while in terms of democratic reform, one may say, well, it gives something, it's a very minor reform. Of course, the other thing that's interesting about these reforms is essentially they predate the GFC. And so what's happened post-GFC is that, of course, the role of the United States as the world's global super economic power, superpower economically speaking, has declined dramatically. And, of course, the debasement of the US dollar has been one of the most obvious examples of that through massive quantitative easing. But perhaps what's really opposite in this situation is that when the IMF asked for more funds most recently and asked New Zealand to contribute and other countries, it was, of course, the United States, the biggest single vote share in the IMF, that refused to make a contribution to the global fund, the global bailout fund, effectively, that Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, was trying to build up in order to save the global economy if there was another crisis. So it is a paradox that this voting reform doesn't deal with the fact that it is the United States that effectively maintains veto within the IMF voting system, but it was the United States that failed to come up with any money to help out with the global bailout fund. And for that reason, if you were one of the big emerging economies, you'd be pretty annoyed by this very, very tepid reform of the voting system at the IMF. And really it doesn't make the kind of changes that we need to make. It's also, I think, that and for those reasons, we think that the democratic reform of the IMF has a long way to go. And really, it still doesn't represent, it still is in some ways enshrined the post-World War II order and doesn't represent the modern world. So we would like the democratic reforms, which this bill implements are very, very minor, to go much, much further, so that the IMF represents the world much better. Even if it were just to represent the economic world, it would be progress, but it certainly, it doesn't represent the world populations in any respect whatsoever. And so, it's very minor reforms. We also think that, if you're going to make these kind of changes, what's the problem with bringing it back to the Parliament? But anyway, the other thing I just wanted to say was just talking about the IMF does a lot of useful work. For those of you who read the IMF website, there's a lot of great research papers come out of the IMF. And of course, David Parker talked earlier about the IMF being, like every international institution, arguing that New Zealand should be adopting a capital gains tax in order to even up the tax system, because our tax system currently gives great advantage to property investment. And the IMF has been a very strong advocate for that. I think the latest IMF report on New Zealand is quite interesting as well, which came out in April, because the IMF was basically agreed with the government strategy, and the Finance Minister rightly said, hey, look, the IMF's agreeing with us. But that was before the government's fiscal position really started to fall apart. And so as the government's fiscal position has gotten worse, it's actually going to make it harder, and it'll be very interesting to see what the IMF, it's more recent, when it comes to do another look at New Zealand, what it thinks of that. Though what was interesting about the IMF, what they said, was that it is the high currency, the New Zealand dollar, that is a real problem to the rebalancing of the New Zealand economy. And they are absolutely on the money on that question. And it is, in this context, worth mentioning that their report on Switzerland, which was done about the same time, whereby the Swiss were doing very unconventional monetary policy, that is, they basically said we're capping the level of the Swiss franc and we'll print endless Swiss francs to stop the Swiss franc becoming too high. Very, very unconventional monetary policy. The IMF's view was that that was an entirely appropriate response to deal with a currency that's becoming too high and is destroying the tradable sector in Switzerland. Now, I think that New Zealand would want to read that report from the IMF, and while it is very unconventional, and I give you that, it does suggest that we need to think a little bit outside the square in the way that we manage our currency in New Zealand. If we read about reports from the IMF a little more closely, we might think a little bit more outside the square. Anyway, Mr. Speaker's telling me to wind up, so thank you very much.
Paul Goldsmith. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.